If you have spent your life feeling everything too deeply, giving everything too freely, and somehow still ending up in rooms full of people who take and never return what they borrowed, this is for you. Not the version of you that smiles through it. The version that lies awake at 3 in the morning wondering why again. Why you again? Before we go any further, if this channel has ever made you feel less alone in your own psychology, leave a like. It costs nothing and it tells us to keep going. Subscribe if you are new. We go deep here, every single day. Now, let us begin. There is a story told in the language of wounds. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning. It moves quietly through a life, threading itself through every significant relationship, every collapse, every moment where you looked across a table at someone who was draining you dry and thought, how did I end up here again? You called yourself an empath. Perhaps someone else called you that first. Sensitive, too much, too open, too feeling. You wore it sometimes like a crown and sometimes like a sentence. You believed, at some level, that your capacity to feel was the thing that made you special, and the same thing that made you a target. And you were not wrong. But you were not entirely right either. Carl Jung would have looked at this pattern. The empath who perpetually draws in darkness, who magnetizes manipulators, emotional predators, the cold and the cruel, and the endlessly needy. And he would not have said what the internet says. He would not have said, you are simply too good for this world. He would not have offered you the comfort of pure victimhood. He would have said, look closer. The darkness you keep attracting is not coming for you from outside. It is coming from inside, from the part of you that has never been named, never been faced, never been integrated. He would have said, your unconscious is doing something. And until you understand what, you will keep drawing the same figures, wearing different faces, carrying the same wound. Jung spent decades mapping the terrain of the human psyche, not the tidy surface of it, the good intentions and the performed virtues, but the full weight of it, the darkness running underneath, the parts that never made it into the light of the conscious identity. He called this territory the shadow. The shadow is not evil. That is the first misunderstanding and perhaps the most dangerous one. The shadow is simply what was pushed away, what was too inconvenient, too threatening, too unacceptable to be included in the persona, the face we show the world, the identity we constructed to survive childhood, to belong, to be loved. In the empath, this construction happens early and it happens completely. The child who feels everything, who is moved by the suffering of others, who absorbs the emotional atmosphere of a room, who cries at things other children walk past, this child learns very quickly which feelings are acceptable and which are not. Sensitivity is celebrated, softness is encouraged, giving is praised. But anger is dangerous, selfishness is shameful. Boundary setting feels like abandonment, aggression, even the healthy kind, the kind that says no, that kind that says, this is mine and you may not have it. This gets buried fast, deep. And so the empath builds an identity almost entirely on the side of light. Compassion, self-sacrifice, attunement to others, an almost compulsive giving, a hunger to heal, to soothe, to fix. And the other side takes the power, the aggression, the will, the capacity for darkness, sinks into the unconscious, into the shadow, where it does not disappear, where it grows. Here is what Jung understood that most people refuse to sit with. The psyche does not simply lose what it buries. It stores it. And what is stored does not stay still. It pressurizes. It seeks expression, and if it cannot express itself consciously, through the person's own choices, their own claim to their own power, It will express itself unconsciously, through projection, through attraction, through the inexplicable pull toward exactly the person who carries what you buried in yourself. This is the mechanism behind what the empath calls their curse. You are not simply attracting darkness from outside. You are recognizing, in the darkness of another person, something that belongs to your own psyche, something you exiled, something you were taught to be ashamed of, something you need. The narcissist, the manipulator, the emotional predator, they carry your shadow for you. They live out the power you will not claim, the aggression you will not own. The selfishness you were taught makes you unlovable. And something in you, below the level of conscious choice, in the deep grammar of the unconscious, is drawn toward them like a body drawn toward its missing half. Jung called this projection, but it goes further than that word usually carries. It is not simply that you see your shadow in them, it is that you need them to carry it, because you cannot yet carry it yourself. The relationship, as destructive as it is serving a psychological function. It is holding the weight of what you will not hold until you do. There is a dream image that appears across cultures, across centuries, across the consulting rooms of analysts who sit in the darkness with their patients and listen. A figure at the threshold, half in shadow, half in light. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, a parent, a lover, an enemy. Sometimes it is shapeless, but it always stands at the door between what is known and what is not. Jung called this the shadow figure in the dream, the part of the psyche that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be acknowledged, to be let in. In the empath's dream world, this figure often arrives wearing the face of someone who hurt them. The cold mother, the narcissistic partner, the friend who took everything and disappeared. And in the dream, the feeling is not always fear. Sometimes it is recognition, sometimes it is something closer to longing. The psyche is precise. It does not waste images. When the face of the person who damaged you appears in your dreams, Jung would say the unconscious is not simply replaying trauma. It is pointing, it is saying, here is where your work is. Here is what this person was carrying on your behalf. Here is what you need to take back. The darkness that keeps arriving in your waking life has a corresponding image in your sleeping life. And both are pointing to the same thing, the unlived life, the unclaimed self, the shadow that has been waiting at your threshold for years. Let us go deeper into the specific wound of the empath. Because it is not a simple wound, it has layers. The first layer is sensitivity. This is real. The nervous system of the highly sensitive person, and Jung would have recognized this type immediately, would have placed them among the introverted feeling types in his typology, processes emotional information differently, more intensely, more completely. There is a genuine permeability to the suffering of others. This is not performance, this is not pathology, but sensitivity in an environment that rewards giving and punishes receiving, in a family system where love was conditional on self-erasure, in a childhood where the only way to be safe was to make everyone else comfortable. Sensitivity becomes a strategy. It becomes the entire architecture of the self. The second layer is the wound of conditional love. Most empaths, when you trace the thread back far enough, had to earn their place, had to be useful, had to be the emotional caretaker of a parent, the peacemaker in a volatile household, the child who sensed everyone's need before their own and made themselves responsible for filling it. They learned that love comes with conditions, that the condition is self-erasure, that the price of belonging is the surrender of the self. This learning goes into the body. It goes into the nervous system. It becomes the unconscious template for every relationship that follows, and this is the third layer, the template. The unconscious does not choose relationships randomly, it seeks repetition. Not because it is broken, but because it is trying to complete something, trying to find in the present the resolution that was impossible in the past, trying to finally be loved without the self-erasure, trying to finally receive without having to give everything first. And so the empath walks into adulthood carrying a template that says, to be loved, I must be needed. And they find, with an almost miraculous precision, exactly the person who will need them completely and love them conditionally. And the pattern plays again and again and again until the shadow is faced. Jung introduced a concept that is almost never discussed in popular Jungian content. He called it Enantiodromia. The word comes from the Greek. It means the tendency of things to transform into their opposite. The principle that any force pushed to an extreme will eventually, inevitably, reverse into what it suppressed. In alchemical language, it is the moment the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the dark phase of transformation, reaches its deepest point and begins to turn, not into what came before, into something new, something that was not possible before the darkness. For the empath, Enantiodromia arrives as a breaking point. It looks different for different people. Sometimes it is the moment they finally end a relationship that has been destroying them for years and feel, underneath the grief, something terrifying and unfamiliar. A cold clarity, a refusal, a rage, a self that will not be moved. Sometimes it is an illness that forces stillness when the giving could not be stopped voluntarily. Sometimes it is a complete collapse, the persona finally shattering under the weight of everything it was never built to carry. This breaking point is not a failure. Jung would have called it the beginning. It is the moment the psyche forces the confrontation it has been orchestrating through years of difficult relationships, the moment the shadow can no longer be held outside the self, projected onto others, carried by the darkness that keeps arriving at the door. The darkness was always yours. It was always asking to be brought home. Now the archetype must be named, because the empath who has lived this pattern, who has given until they had nothing, attracted darkness until they were broken by it, hit the enantiodromic breaking point, and survived, is not simply a wounded person. They are standing at the threshold of one of the most ancient initiations in the human story, the wounded healer. Jung drew this archetype from the myth of Chiron, the centaur of Greek mythology, who was both the wisest teacher and the most incurably wounded figure in the mythic world. Struck by a poisoned arrow, unable to heal himself despite his extraordinary healing gifts, Chiron carries a wound that never closes, and it is precisely this wound that makes him the greatest healer. Not because suffering is noble, but because the healer who has descended into their own darkness carries a knowledge that no training can provide. They know the terrain, they have been there, they can accompany others into the darkness because they have made the journey themselves. The empath who faces the shadow, who retrieves their own power, who integrates the aggression and the will and the selfishness they were taught to bury, who stops projecting their darkness to others and begins to own it. This person does not simply heal themselves, they become a figure of genuine transformation for everyone they encounter, but only after the descent, only after the shadow is faced, only after the wound is owned rather than hidden. This is not a metaphor, this is a psychological reality that Jung documented across thousands of clinical hours. The person who individuates who undergoes the full process of integrating what was split off and buried, urges changed at a fundamental level, not perfected, not without pain, but whole in a way that the person who only lives in the light can never be. There is a specific practice Jung offered for this work. He called it active imagination. It is not meditation in the conventional sense. It is not visualization as modern self-help uses it. It is a direct dialogue with the contents of the unconscious, a deliberate descent into the image world of the psyche with the intention not of controlling what is found there, but of meeting it, speaking to it, listening to what it has to say. For the empath working with the shadow, active imagination might begin like this. You sit with the image of the person who most damaged you. Not to relive the pain, not to assign blame, but to ask a different question entirely. What were they carrying for you? What quality did they embody that you had buried in yourself? What did their particular darkness reflect back to you about your own unlived life? This is not forgiveness work. This is not reconciliation. It has nothing to do with the other person at all. It is a retrieval, a turning of the attention from the external figure, who was always, in some sense, a messenger, toward the interior territory they were pointing to, the part of the self that was given into exile, the power that was surrendered, the will that was taught to be silent. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the empath, this is not a philosophical observation. It is an exact description of lived experience, the pattern that felt like fate, the inexplicable return of the same figures, the same wounds, the same dynamic wearing different faces. It was not fate at all. It was the unconscious speaking the only language available to it. The language of repetition, the language of what is unfinished. When the unconscious is made conscious, the repetition stops, not because the world changes, because the person does. Let us speak now about what integration actually looks like, because the language of shadow work is used constantly in popular psychology and almost never given its true weight. Integration is not the decision to be more assertive. It is not a journal entry about boundaries. It is not a social media post about choosing yourself. Integration, in the Jungian sense, is a deep and often painful process of expanding the self to include what was previously unacceptable. It is meeting the rage and discovering it is not destructive, it is protective. It is meeting the selfishness and discovering it is not cruelty. It is the rightful claim of a self that was never allowed to exist. It is meeting the capacity for coldness, for withdrawal, for refusal, and discovering that these are not the opposite of love. They are the condition of love that is free. For the empath, this looks like the first time they say no and do not apologize. Not the performance of a boundary rehearsed in a therapist's office. The actual no, arriving from somewhere beneath thought, from the part of the psyche that has been waiting years to speak. It looks like the first time they feel anger without immediately converting it into concern for the other person's feelings. The anger that simply is. That does not perform. That does not ask for permission to exist. It looks like the first time they sit in the presence of someone else's pain and do not rush to fix it, not because they have become cold, because they have become whole enough to let another person carry their own weight. These are not small moments. In the economy of the psyche, these are seismic. And here is where the alchemical language becomes precise. Jung was deeply influenced by alchemy, not as a primitive science, but as a symbolic map of psychological transformation. The alchemists were not trying to turn lead into gold. They were describing, in the only language available to them, the process of turning the base matter of the unconscious self into the refined gold of the individuated soul. The empath's journey through the shadow follows the alchemical stages exactly. The nigredo, the blackening, is the period of dissolution, the collapse of the false self, the moment the persona can no longer hold, the relationship that breaks everything, the illness, the silence that falls when there is nothing left to give and no one who noticed. This is the darkest point. And it is the beginning. The albedo and the whitening is the emergence of the first light within the darkness, not hope in the sentimental sense, something more austere. A new self-knowing, the capacity to sit with what is real rather than what is performed, the first tentative meetings with the shadow, the first recognitions, the first retrievals, the rubedo, the reddening, is the integration, the marriage of the light and the dark within the self. The empath who has fully descended and fully returned, who carries both their sensitivity and their power, their compassion and their will, this person is the rubedo, the gold that the darkness was always producing, that the suffering was always pointing toward. You do not reach the rubedo without the nigredo. There is no path around the darkness. There is only the path through it. Now the question that the empath always returns to, the one that sits beneath all the others, that the psychology can circle without quite answering. Why? Why me? Why this gift and this wound, this particular shape of suffering? Jung did not believe in accident, not at the level of the psyche. He believed in what he called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence, the event that carries weight beyond its surface, the pattern that cannot be explained by causality but can be read as meaning. The empath's wound is not random. The particular shape of it, the hunger to heal, the compulsive giving, the capacity to feel the pain of others as their own, the tendency to attract exactly the figures who will break them open. This is a configuration, a specific shape of soul. And in Jungian thought, the specific wound points toward the specific gift, not as compensation, not as reward, as purpose. The empath who descends into the shadow and returns is not the same person who fell. They are the wounded healer, not as title, not as identity to perform on the internet, but as psychological reality, as lived experience, as the specific form their individuation was always going to take. The darkness they attracted was always the entrance, not the destination. There is a moment in the process of individuation that Jung described as the encounter with the self, not the small self, the ego, the persona, the constructed identity, the self with a capital letter, the totality of the psyche, the center that the ego circles without being able to encompass. What religious traditions have called the soul, the Atman, the divine spark. Jung gave it a psychological name and a clinical precision, but he never denied its numinous quality. The encounter with the self arrives after the shadow has been faced, after the descent, after the dissolution and the first reconstruction. It arrives as an experience of weight, of rightness, of coming home to something that was always there and always waiting. For the empath, this encounter often comes quietly, after years of living in relation to everyone else, shaped by what others needed, defined by what others felt, existing in the electromagnetic field of everyone else's pain. The encounter with the self is the first experience of their own ground, the first sense of standing on something that belongs entirely to them. That does not shift with the needs of others. That will not be given away. This is not coldness. This is not the hardening that pain sometimes produces, the protective armor that shuts the world out. This is integration. The empath who stands in their own ground does not feel less. They feel more freely, because now the feeling belongs to them. It is not a compulsion. It is a choice. and choice is the beginning of freedom. One last image. There is a gate at the edge of the known world. Every tradition has a version of it, the threshold between what was and what is becoming, between the life lived for others and the life that finally truly belongs to the self. Most people stand at this gate for years. They approach it and retreat. They feel its pull and find reasons to turn back. The known darkness is more comfortable than the unknown light. The familiar wound is easier than the unfamiliar wholeness. But some people, the ones who have been broken enough, descended far enough, emptied completely enough, find that the retreat is no longer possible. The life behind them has dissolved, the persona has shattered, the shadow has been faced, and the gate is the only way forward. You are not here by accident. The life that brought you to this moment, the giving that was taken, the love that was used, the darkness that kept arriving, the breaking point you survived, none of it was wasted. The psyche does not waste anything. It transforms everything. This is the most dangerous and the most important thing Carl Jung ever said, the one that the self-help industry softens and the academic world academicizes, and the empath at 3 a.m. needs to hear in its full, undiminished weight. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Not the acceptable self, not the healed self, not the self that is ready, the whole self, the darkness and the light, the wound and the gift, the power you buried and the love you never stopped offering, the rage and the tenderness, the boundary and the compassion, all of it, without apology, without performance, without asking permission from anyone who is not you. That is individuation. That is the gate. That is what was waiting on the other side of every darkness that ever arrived at your door. If something in this reached you, leave a like.